Well, regardless of who was on the other side of the line of scrimmage, 51-3 against an FBS team is little to complain about. And of course, that was the final score from Norman as Oklahoma started its run as an SEC school with a 51-3 win over Temple last Friday night. And Houston is the next opponent, of course. 1 year overlap in the Big 12, but this is a team that in the past Oklahoma's run into. Most notably and most recently, I believe that 2016 team with Baker Mayfield. This is our Sooners live show, folks. Please leave those comments and questions. Consider the super chat contribution as well, right here at the Voice of College Football. And right next to me, as always, our guy Jason Ray. Jason, how you doing today?
Doing good, Mark. How about you?
I'm doing well. And the Sooners again. That was an easy piece of work for them last week. So maybe on some levels difficult to evaluate because the level of opponents going to just, considering the SEC is going to like skyrocket in about 2 weeks. But at the same time, there are your high level power programs. I'll point out Oregon that was in a 3-point game in the fourth quarter with Idaho. So it's not a given that you're going to just take care of business, but Oklahoma did just that. So what stood out to you on the positive side?
Yeah, I think so. From a positive side, I think the defense played really well, right? I mean, you saw they forced 6 turnovers in the game. Temple really, they had one drive where they were able to really put something together, and part of that was enabled by a 15-yard penalty that kind of got them in field goal range. But other than that, the defense was clean. There was no, I think, a lot of the things that you've seen in the past, like just kind of looking over to the sideline, looking for late calls, and just some confusion in the back end. So none of that was there. So tackled well, covered well. The defensive line specifically, I believe there was either 5 or 6 sacks in the game. All of them were from the defensive line. So I think there was a big positive in how Oklahoma played from a defensive perspective, just overall. Not really necessarily singling anyone out, but defensive line particularly was probably the bright spot. Overall, forcing all of those turnovers really kind of changed the game. Obviously, especially there in the second quarter. I think another bright spot for Oklahoma was Jackson Arnold. Right, he looked really, really good early. When you look at the stats, only threw for 141 yards, but did have those 4 touchdowns and really made a lot of good decisions. Didn't put the ball in danger. There was never really any situation where you thought that he put the ball in harm's way. So I think as far as that goes, protecting the ball, that was really good. I think Taylor Tatum was another big positive situation for Oklahoma. I mean, coming in as the number 1 rated running back in the country, and playing for a guy like DeMarco Murray, you had a feeling that he'd be a guy that got a few carries just to see how things went. Right, but I think he looked probably like maybe the best back. So I think it'll be interesting going forward in these next 2 non-conference games, Mark, just to see how many carries that he got. Gavin Sawchuk, did not look great, just to be honest. Like, I know we're talking about the positives here, but I think that opened up the door maybe for Sam Franklin, Javonte Barnes to get a few more carries. And I think another, from a positive perspective, Deion Burks, 3 of the 4 touchdown receptions, or 3 of the 4 touchdown passes that were thrown by Jackson Arnold came via Deion Burks. The other one was Bauer Sharp. So I think Deion Burks and Bauer Sharp were 2 really big positives for this Oklahoma team. So a lot that you can take away from that. Understanding, obviously, when you look at Temple is not a good football team. Probably one of the I mean, we'll see as the season goes on, but I mean, I think at least going in, Mark, you probably think this is probably one of the 5 worst FBS teams in the country, but we'll see how they play as they continue to go. But I think the thing that you like, and again, this is I think a positive. I think that you like for Oklahoma is the fact that the schedule over the first 4 weeks gets increasingly tougher. Right when you talk about Temple, then you talk about Houston, and then Tulane, and then the SEC opener against Tennessee. So I think that's going to kind of help this team as you go forward. And I think the other thing was that I took away, and this is really a neutral comment, Mark, not really positive nor negative, but Oklahoma was very, very vanilla offensively. In this game, there was a comparison that they ran their entire offense in about a 20-yard box. So they didn't really go deep except for one of the first plays of the game when they went deep to Jalil Farouk. Other than that, everything was short. As you can see, there was the one catch for Farouk, but other than that, everybody else had an under 10-yard average. So a lot of stuff like in the flats and then the intermediate passing games. So I think that'll be interesting to see, what this team looks like as the playbook opens up a bit.
Yeah, point well taken on the schedule, because I would think that that's exactly the way a coach would want it, that we go out there against the easiest opponent. Of course, he's not going to talk to the team about them being the easiest opponent, but they're no dummies. They know what the records are and what information is out there. But you start with Temple, then Houston. Shoot, at this point, and we'll delve a little bit deeper into the Cougars the rest of the show, but they look like one of the worst power conference teams based on both their projection of the roster and personnel, but then also based on the showing of coming up against a good Mountain West team, but still losing to a Mountain West team by 3 touchdowns at home. Houston's not going to be a very good team. And then the step up to then, wow, one of the best group of 5s in Tulane, and then boom, into the SEC. So those steps up, and it allows the coaching staff to correct mistakes, develop players further, get them ready for a tougher assignment each time, rather than just getting punched in the mouth. And then the next week, maybe they take on an FCS team and they're all over the place. This is as you pointed out, a definite buildup to the SEC season. So let me ask you this, Jason, in terms of the offensive line, this being the group that has had the most scrutiny during the offseason, and I think it's a given that even if people expect a big-time program to have an offensive line that's going to struggle, that they're just going to go out and mow over anyone who's in the group of 5. And if you look across the country, not just this season, any season, that's not necessarily the case. You just assume, well, the talent gap is so huge in the weight and conditioning program that it's just going to be a joke. But that's not always the case. So that being the case, in reality, how would you evaluate Oklahoma's offensive line?
So clearly, I think among media and then just kind of fans, the offensive line was the biggest, probably the biggest point of contention with this game. Oklahoma just they weren't able to run the ball as effectively as you would have thought, and I think, Mark, the end numbers look maybe a little bit better than what it actually was, right? So because you've got 65 of your 220 yards came on 2 runs by Taylor Tatum and Sam Franklin. So, but I think for the balance of the game, Oklahoma wasn't really able to get a lot of push in the run game. Jackson Arnold was sacked, I think, four times in the game, and part of that was maybe a little bit due to his ability, his just kind of being new to a certain degree. His first regular season start, held the ball too long on a couple of occasions that ended up being a sack. But yeah, I think the jury's still out. I think there's some major concerns, honestly, and whether it be just productivity or whether it be health of that offensive line. Branson Hickman had 10 snaps until he had to go out with an ankle injury, and now for an offensive line, this is tough. A lineman, this is tough. He's got a knee issue on one leg and an ankle issue on another. So understanding what his health and what that looks like. When he came out of the game, Garen Hatchett moved over from one of the guard positions to the center. He's got an issue with his left arm, is really kind of playing with an arm and a half, so to speak. And so when he got beat, every time that he got beat over his left shoulder. So obviously, being a center and being able to move laterally and have to do all the things that you have to do in terms of calling out the defense and things like that. Playing with 1.5 arms obviously is really tough. They have Jake Taylor, their starting right tackle, who was out with an injury as well. Spencer Brown, who came in, was a transfer over from Michigan State, was really kind of up and down in the spring. Had been better in the fall, but he was, to put it nicely, Mark, he was not good, not effective in that game. And so I think part of it is getting these guys healthy, and it's a big balancing act, right, Mark? Because you've got, and this from an offensive line perspective, these guys need to have that cohesion. You've got to have these 5 to 7 guys playing together at all times, as much as possible to get that cohesion, to gel as a unit, and be ready for, specifically Tulane, but more importantly, conference season when that starts. And so I think there's just I think probably, Mark, wait and see aspect with that. And so when you look at it, Oklahoma won the game 51-3, 48-point win, covered the spread, like all of those things. But what is the thing that you look about if you're kind of looking at it, analyzing this a little bit deeper? What would that score have been like if the turnovers weren't there, right? Would this have been a 21, 24-point game? Because one of the things you looked at and what was a little bit, eye-opening is the fact that before the final drive, Oklahoma had under 300 yards of total offense in the game. And so you think about the competition level and you think about what's going on, and in terms of injury situation and things like that. So I think it's a little bit concerning, but I think it's a little bit of a, it's concerning for game one, but let's wait and see. What happens, right? So I think there's a lot of, and now, we've talked about this a little bit. So there was a position group that was, and we talked, like I said, in the preseason here, a position group, Mark, that was perceived to be a real strength of the team, in the wide receiver core. Now you've got Jaden Gibson out for the year. Now you've got Jalil Fruit, for all intents and purposes, out for a large majority of the year. He's going to be out for 6 to 8 weeks. So you think even like good case scenario for him, he's back for 2 or 3 regular season games at the end of the season. Nick Anderson did not play in the game last Friday, nursing a little bit of a hamstring injury. And obviously those injuries, especially for wide receivers, skill position players, are very very problematic, right? And so you take away, that's 3 starters off of your wide receiver core. Now you're relying on some young kids. You're relying on Brendan Thompson is incredibly young, but he doesn't have a lot of starting experience. So you're looking at Brendan Thompson. You're looking at maybe an Ivan Carrion, who played a little bit. You're looking at J.J. Hester, who, again, he was a guy that got some opportunities and dropped a couple of passes and a couple of big passes. So again, I think there's some things to be a little bit concerned about, but I think it's not time to to write anything off. I think you have to look and see if there's some ways that schematically that they can overcome these things. And you would expect that you not necessarily need all these guys back for Houston on the offensive line and the wide receiver group. But again, I think it would be it's going to be a good opportunity to see some of these young kids and see, do they have the ability to what kind of impact are they going to have the ability to give, right? I mean, I think your number one here is Deion Burks, probably coming in. He was your number one. He's definitely going to get more targets and things like this. But just kind of the injury bug that's going through the offensive line and the wide receiver group is going to be something that we make sure that we watch for Oklahoma, just to see how healthy they can get and how quickly they can get healthy.
The Sooners matchup coming up on Saturday, folks, is going to be on the SEC Network. So it's a primetime game on the SEC Network against Houston. Cougars coming off a 27-7 loss against UNLV. The last time these two teams got together, I'm almost positive, was 2016 when Houston upset Oklahoma, and that was the Baker Mayfield team that went on to win the Big 12 and win the Sugar Bowl. All right, folks, leave those comments and questions. We will get to them here at the Voice of College Football. And we got Jason right here to continue to break down Oklahoma football. We got Steve Helwick, who's going to stop by the last half of the show from SB Nation to give us a perspective on Houston. And so one of the last things you said there, Jason, had to do with young players needing to step up because of these injuries. Outside of Taylor Tatum, were there any true freshmen who, because of the score, got the opportunity and looked the part and showed that they might be contributors this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think not from a statistical perspective, but Ivan Carrion played a little bit more in the second half. I think from a body size perspective, he's a guy that will have the opportunity to help them early on. I believe he only had one catch for 2 yards, but he did play quite a bit. Zion Raggins had one catch for 7 yards, I believe. So those were the two guys that obviously they didn't have probably the same impact from a statistical perspective that Taylor Tatum did. But I think at the same time, they looked like they could be a couple of guys, and it may not necessarily matter if they look like it or not. They're probably going to have to be that, and just kind of just throw them out there and see what happens, right? I mean, because you only, when you lose, and I think it'll be interesting to see if Nick Anderson's able to go. If he's able to go, I think you feel a lot more comfortable about at least your 1-2 punch there. But you've got a lot of other kids, Mark, that just haven't produced in their career, whether it be J.J. Hester. I mean, Brennan Thompson to a degree, but he hasn't had a lot of opportunities. And then you've got about 2 or 3 freshmen that are there. So I think it's very intriguing. It's going to be very intriguing to watch. I think the way, and this is just kind of just the way things are looking right now, Mark, I think they're relying on this defense early on. They're going to rely on the defense to, to shut down these early non-conference opponents and allow the offense to kind of get its bearings, which is, complete 180 of what we've come to expect from Oklahoma. But even there, I mean, I think it will be interesting. Does Oklahoma become more of a run-heavy team? With maybe some inexperience that they have at the wide receiver position. And so, I think it'll be, like I said, that'll be very intriguing to watch. And Mark, just kind of watching these teams, and I think these teams, this schedule, like, I mean, Tennessee looked fantastic, and again, you take it with a grain of salt when with some of these teams, but some of these SEC teams just, I think it was from what I read, Mark, the largest margin of victory for a single conference ever in one single week. And granted, I know that obviously the competition was low level FBS or mostly FCS level, but Tennessee looked really good. Auburn looked really good. So I think a couple of those games early on that we've identified as swing games for Oklahoma, that maybe they weren't top half of the SEC might look a little bit tougher. Now, I think the good thing about that, Mark, is with Auburn playing Cal, with Tennessee playing NC State, you get a little bit of a better sample size of what that looks like. But still, I think it still puts a little bit of sense of urgency, if there wasn't one already, on allowing this team to get healthy. So I think that's the balancing act this week, particularly, but even next week against Tulane. Like, what do you hold some of these kids out again for another week that may be in a situation, if they were playing Tennessee, could play, but should they play this week? I mean, I think you've got to. But I think the other side of it, Mark, is you want to be not necessarily a complete team as of yet, but what you want to start, like, getting to that point where you feel like you're rolling. So I think that's going to be to see how Venables handles that this week, heading against Tulane, because we'll get into Houston, but Houston's not a good football team. Like, they looked very, very bad on the offensive line, particularly, but they scored late, like the last possession of that game, and their defense didn't play too bad, particularly against the pass. But he has a bit of a gimmick offense, but they were really good. But Houston looked worse than kind of I anticipated coming in. So you probably have the luxury of setting some of these guys that at least you would think that you do.
Back to Taylor Tatum, because we've got this Sawchuk and Barnes duo, and now, as we've talked about here, Taylor Tatum, it's not a big shock because of the status of his talent coming into college football that he may become a factor in this run game, and it certainly was, as statistically the best back. But just looking at the backs, and I know that you followed his recruitment and then when he was signed and looked at huddle tape and that sort of thing, but now seeing him on the field in a real game, how does he compare to Sawchuk and Barnes, some of the other recent backs, Marcus Major, Kennedy Brooks, those guys, in terms of style and what he will eventually grow into?
Yeah, I think he's a little bit of a combination in terms of, one of the big runs that he had, he was able to kind of bounce it outside and go down the sideline for that 35-yard carry. But again, he had some good runs in between the tackles as well. So I think it's hard to identify. I mean, maybe a little bit more like Joe Mixon in the fact that he was able to, he's able to run between the tackles and get outside. I think one of the things, I mean, when you look at how he stacks up against the group, I think conventional wisdom was there was something off with Gavin Sawchuk on Friday, and I don't know what that was. I don't think it was injury related, but he looked very tentative. He looked probably, honestly, like the fourth best running back outside of Taylor Tatum, Sam Franklin, and Javonte Barnes. So, I don't know, and that's not anything that was exhibited in fall camp, from what I understand. But I think, if nothing else, Mark, I think it's very helpful that I think that they feel that they've got 4 or 5 guys that they can use. And so if this season ends up being a season where they're a little bit more run heavy than they are pass heavy, with some of the issues going on, injuries going on at the wide receiver position, it is a situation where where they might have to rely on those 4 or 5. The biggest thing with a true freshman and younger kids from a running back perspective is, how do they pick up the blitz? How do they identify that, or do they block well? Interestingly enough, that's another thing that Gavin Sawchuk struggled with. There was a sack late in the game on the third down, I should say in the second half, not late in the game, where Jackson Arnold got up and he was visibly annoyed, and it was Gavin Sawchuk. He missed the blitzer, and I think he got an earful on the sidelines as well. And so, you never know with kids what's going on, but the fact that I think they feel good about 4 or 5 guys. I think the one thing that was interesting is Caleb Hicks did not play hardly at all in that game, but I think when you look at Taylor Tatum, it'll be interesting to see if his carries go up on Saturday, because I believe he only had, like, I think, was it 7 or 8 carries, but he had he over 10 yards per carry, I think, or close to it there. So you would like to see his volume go up a little bit and see how that happens. So I think it's when you look at number one recruits, 5-star guys, typically they don't wait a whole while to get on the field, a long while to get on the field. And so it was good to see him produce there, but I think it'll be interesting to see how he continues to produce through the non-conference season.
Folks, keep in mind that while Oklahoma is a 29.5-point favorite in this game, not that I expect them to be challenged by Houston, but the same guy that is coaching the Houston team, of course, this is Willie Fritz. So he came from Tulane to Houston. He is the guy that engineered a near scare. Well, it was a scare, a near upset, because there was a 4th down play at midfield in a 40-35 game. Mm-hmm. And that Tulane team finished 2-10. So Houston might be on its way to something close to that, but you never know. It's probably a pretty similar, even though this is a power conference team, and that Tulane team in 2021? Yeah, 2021. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That had the makings of the 2022 team that won 12 games and won the Cotton Bowl. Mm-hmm. So obviously there was a core there that we found out was pretty good. But that particular team couldn't put things together and lost 10 games. But on that day in Norman, they almost pulled it off. And again, the same coach, Willie Fritz, will be on the sideline for Houston. All right, folks, appreciate you being here. Yeah, it looked like you were ready to take off on something there, Jason.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, he's been one of the most respected coaches in the group of 5. So, I mean, I think it was, I heard this stat yesterday, and I guess I shouldn't be surprised by this because of the way the transfer portal works, and specifically when there's new coaches that come in. But I think they had somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 65 new players, which is just astronomical to me. Like, that's almost, that's like almost a 70% rebuild of your roster. So, you have to expect a little bit of struggle early on in the year when you have that many new faces into the program. But he's such a good coach. I don't really have any doubts that he'll get that turned around. But Houston's a tough place to. It's a tough place to. It's not necessarily a tough place to recruit to, because you're really in a hotbed. But you got to battle A&M, you got to battle Texas for a lot of those guys. But I think he'll be successful there. But 60 to 65 new players is just astronomical.
And I'm guessing that the majority of those players are going to play, meaning that you're not necessarily turning over the program players unless they came in fairly highly touted and they're frustrated because they're buried on the depth chart and they're moving on. But there's always that layer of players that know they're program players, know that they're not going to play. They're either walk-ons, or even if they're scholarship players, there's a certain expectation of what they were going to be. So I would think that the bulk of those 65 players, like, he's turning over most of the top end of the roster. And so those are startling, significant transition there for, and we're getting used to these numbers more and more in terms of what we are seeing with these transfer portal additions and subtractions. Folks, we appreciate you being here, the Voice of College Football. This is our weekly Oklahoma show. Jason's here, of course, and we also have Steve Helwick now from SB Nation's Hustle Belt and Underdog Dynasty. Steve joins us on a regular basis here at the Voice of College Football to break things down. Steve, how you doing today?
I'm doing excellent. Glad to be back on here. It'll be about 2.5 hours from now. I'll be live on the hilltop from SMU BYU, and then be making my way up to Norman tomorrow for my first time ever at a Sooners home game against Houston.
SMU and BYU. So, like Houston, this is another team that shared a conference with Oklahoma for 1 year.
Mhm.
And then we got SMU, who's pretty familiar with Oklahoma. They run into each other quite often, including last season, of course. What do you expect out of that one briefly before we get to the Oklahoma-Houston game?
SMU surprised me in week 1 that they really had to fight for that Nevada win. They were 25-point favorites in that Nevada game, and they really needed a fourth quarter dominant stretch to be able to win that game. But I think that they're battle tested enough now. They have a lot of returning experience, while BYU has a lot more moving parts, where I think SMU can deliver a home win. But I think BYU's physicality keeps it close in this one, and the Mustangs win a close game on the hilltop.
All right. So here we go with Houston and Oklahoma. And we were talking about Willie Fritz and what he accomplished at Tulane. And of course, he is taking over at Houston and has a reclamation project on his hands. So most people are aware that follow college football about Donovan Smith. One of the last times we talked to you, of course, Steve, was on the field in Houston after he pulled off the Hail Mary to beat West Virginia. We noticed that pretty much the entire Houston rushing attack is back. One of their top receivers is back as well, although they lost Sam Brown to Miami. Just your thoughts about Houston coming into this game, coming off just a game in which they scored only one touchdown at home against UNLV.
Yeah, I don't think that the opener could have unfolded in any worse fashion for Houston. It looked like a team that wasn't prepared to play the game, although Willie Fritz said in the post-game press conference that it may have been over preparation at some points. The offense really couldn't have a starting point, and that all starts in the foundation of the trenches. UNLV overwhelmed Houston's offensive line so much that nothing was able to be accomplished by Donovan Smith in the passing game or by the run game, really. And they really abandoned that run game pretty early on. Yeah, Donovan Smith finished 15 of 30 passing. He had 2 interceptions in the second half, but the game was already a 3-score game before any turnovers. So I don't think turnovers really played that big of a difference in the result of the game, because Donovan Smith just didn't have time to throw. He only completed 2 throws beyond 9 yards in those 30 attempts because he just didn't have time for his routes to develop. Houston, they're replacing 4 starters on the offensive line, including a second-round NFL draft pick and Patrick Paul currently with the Dolphins. So they didn't really recruit heavily from the transfer portal on the offensive line. So they're using last year's backups is their guys right now. So it's a unit that really needs to gel together throughout the season, because they got overwhelmed in that UNLV game, and it really showed in the passing game as Donovan Smith could only complete short out routes to the flats the entire game, and UNLV's defense didn't really have to defend anything beyond 10 yards because nothing was developing more than 10 yards there. And then the one other thing I want to bring up about the offense, look at those rushing numbers. Parker Jenkins, 2 carries, 17 yards. He was their leading rusher last year. He's their feature back. He did not receive a single carry in the second half, and it wasn't injury related. They just abandoned the run game. So I think against Oklahoma, that's something you're going to have to play into your favor more. You have a veteran running back room. Parker Jenkins is back. Stacy Snead was a pretty good back in 2022. You got to use those running backs more because they use too much quarterback draw, too much quarterback running. And I think that after Parker Jenkins, he had a 13-yard carry last week, which was one of their more explosive plays until the backups came in. So got to ride Parker Jenkins a bit more this week.
Well, Steve, I think I've got the answer to the whole problem here. Play the backup quarterback. He's got a QBR of 97. Donovan Smith, 3.9. I think that's an easy fix. There you go. Boom.
Stats can be deceiving when the backups are in. You see how the game unfold. UNLV on the last drive, they're playing a different defensive strategy, not trying to play as aggressive and pressure every time. But Oklahoma had 6 sacks on Temple last week, so this probably isn't the best timing for an Oklahoma matchup for Houston coming off the week it did. I think Houston kind of wants to regroup against like an FCS opponent or something, get its offense figured out, and then attack Oklahoma. But this is going to be a super challenging matchup because the Cougars were 60 seconds away from their first home shutout since 1994 last week.
Yeah. Jason, anything for Steve?
So I think just Steve, on your thought process of Houston coming into this game, just from their expectations. Obviously, you're going into any game, you're going to go in and you're going to attempt to win. But is what, obviously outside of a huge upset, what constitutes a successful trip for Houston? in this game? Is it one of those things where you think that they're gonna try to, and I don't want to say milk the clock, but try to get out of there as quickly as possible without any injuries, or do you see kind of any changes on the offensive line or something just from a strategic perspective that allow them to be much more successful offensively against Oklahoma?
They're better than that, a type of team that has to go in with the mindset of just get out of here with any injuries. Houston knows that did not play to the standard in week one. I mean, you have a veteran quarterback in Donovan Smith. He's someone, he went toe-to-toe with Texas last year, a college football playoff team. They beat a 9-4 West Virginia, and some of those surrounding pieces on offense are still there, like Parker Jenkins, Joseph Manjack at receiver. And they don't really have too many defensive starters back, just really Jamal Morris and A.J. Halsey. So a lot of moving parts defensively. They have the fifth most newcomers in the entire FBS, I think 66 newcomers. So what I think the goal is at Oklahoma is just to show improvement, especially on the offensive side, show that you can pass protect, kind of win some of those battles in the trenches because you weren't winning any of them against UNLV. The secondary did look good against UNLV, and if I think that there's any area where Houston can gain some advantage, it would be their veteran defensive back group composed of a lot of transfers. That group against Oklahoma's super shorthanded receiving core, which you lose Jaden Gibson, you lose Jaleel Farouk, and then Nick Anderson and Andrell Anthony seem day-to-day. So that's an area where I think Houston could have an advantage because they held UNLV to 7 of 14 passing. They looked good defending the pass. The only problem was UNLV had a very slippery quarterback. He rushed for 2 straight seasons of 1,200 yards in the FCS, was a first-team FCS All-American. Jackson Arnold can run, but he doesn't present that same type of run-first philosophy. So I think that Houston, they don't have to play as much contained. So I think that kind of changes the strategy on defense. But you don't want to get blown out in this game. You don't want to lose by what the spread's 29 points. You want to keep this close. And Willie Fritz has done that before as a considerable underdog in Norman. Last time he was there, he was a 31.5-point dog with a 2-10 Tulane team. And he came, 44 yards away from victory in that one with Michael Pratt coming up short on a 4th down scramble.
Well, Steve, while we got you here, even though we're focused on the Houston side, you obviously have your impressions of Oklahoma, and not just going to the 51-3 demolition of Temple, but just in regards to the entire team and just your impressions of what you think they could do in the SEC this year.
It's a rare time where I'm more impressed by Oklahoma's defense than their offense. I think Zach Alley was a home run hire. What he did at Jacksonville State last year at an FBS upstart team, producing a 9-4 record with them, and really having a suffocating defense. Just their 4th game in FBS, they were producing a shutout on an Eastern Michigan team, which made bowl eligibility last year. I was very impressed with how sound the tackling was in Zach Alley's defense last year. And you saw that translate in that Temple game. The defense was flying around everywhere, producing turnovers. They had that 6-0 advantage in that turnover department. And Oklahoma has guys on defense. I mean, you have Danny back at linebacker. You have Billy Bowman back, who was one of the best safeties in the country last year. I think their defense is very loaded this year. And then you work the transfer portal. You got Williams from TCU. You got some guys in there that are really going to make an impact. So that's what I'm most impressed with Oklahoma. And I think that could be one of the best defenses in the SEC. Offensively, there's still more I have to see out of this team. You don't have the veteran quarterback in Dylan Gabriel anymore. Jackson Arnold last week, I think we only saw him complete like one pass beyond 14 yards, that 47-yarder to Farouk early on in that game. So I want to see more out of him. He had a bit of mistakes in the Alamo Bowl last year, a lot of turnovers. One wasn't his fault, that pick six to Gunnar Maldonado, but you need to see Arnold develop as a quarterback before I can really say this is a playoff team more. And also offensive line play, they kind of got pushed around by Temple at some times, which was not a promising sign in that 51-3 win. I think the 3rd down conversion thing, that might just be a one-game anomaly starting 0 of 11 there. But I think the Sooners, they have work to do, but I think they have a really good starting foundation, and having a defense that I think is championship caliber really helps.
Steve Helwick breaking down Houston with the matchup coming up on the SEC Network Saturday night against Oklahoma. You can catch Steve's work at Hustle Belt and also Underdog Dynasty at SB Nation. Anything, Steve, in particular that people should be tracking in regards to your work?
I mean, I'm all over the place. Last week I was at Wisconsin, Western Michigan. That was a fun Friday night
Nice.
game. And then I went to Houston UNLV for Willie Fritz's opener there. So yeah, I said I have BYU, SMU on the docket tonight, and then Houston, Oklahoma. Just looking forward to my first trip in Norman and excited to cover this game. There have been some good Houston, Oklahoma games in recent memory. 2019, it was a game where Jalen Hurts really burst on the scene. He was a fine quarterback at Alabama, but it was when he got to Oklahoma where he really looked like he could be a star. I think he had like 300 something passing yards, almost 200 rushing yards, and 6 touchdowns in that first game. We'll get to see him play on the pro stage tonight. And then there was that 2016 game with the kick return, or the kick 6 from Houston, and where the Cougars knocked off Oklahoma 33-16 or 33-23 is the opener. I forget what the score was, but I'm excited for another installment of this series and looking forward to my first trip up there in Norman.
Well, you picked me up on that one, Steve, because I forgot about the 2019 game. Yeah, 49-31. I kept going back to the 2016 game as being the last one I could remember of these two teams getting together. But yeah, Jalen Hurts and the opener, yes, for that playoff team, beat Houston. Good stuff. Well, Steve, appreciate you being here. Safe travels. Enjoy the games, and we will talk to you soon.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me on.
All right. Well, Jason, before we wrap it up, if you got a couple minutes, I'd just like to get your impressions of week 1 across the country. What was important to you? What do you think stood out? And before I let you run with that, it just kind of hit me in this. I may not be the brightest guy in the world because this should have hit me a long time ago. I guess it really sunk in when I was looking at games coming up this week, like Iowa, Iowa State, NC State, Tennessee, that with this expanded playoff, these matchups suddenly become something that before would just be, oh, that's a decent game. But nobody expects NC State to have a shot at a playoff, or even Tennessee to have a shot at a 4-team playoff. But suddenly, well, Tennessee, they could go 10-2. They could reach the playoffs. Iowa, are they going to win a Big Ten championship? Nobody believes that. But can they have a shot at the playoff? And if you look at their schedule, it sets up pretty well. And even Iowa State, even though the path is kind of different in the Big 12 than it is the other conferences and the ACC as well, especially with the ACC dropping every meaningful game in sight, it's almost like, well, is this an important game for Iowa State? Well, it should be really important, but maybe they just have to win the conference, and maybe that's going to be it for the Big 12 anyway, so it may not matter, but certainly for Iowa. So that was just in regards to setting up these games for week 2 that really set in, is that suddenly Tennessee, NC State, this is a big deal, or it could be.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Mark. I think the implosion to a certain degree of the ACC was interesting, specifically Florida State. My gosh, I didn't see that coming. I mean, not to the level that they've struggled so far, right? Like I wasn't certain that they would be able to kind of maintain what they had last year. However, just getting pushed around, and yeah, that was surprising. I thought Clemson would be a little bit more competitive than what they were, against obviously Georgia's either the best or one of the 2-3 best teams in the country, right? But specifically in the second half, and really just, didn't see Cade Klubnik making that next step that you would expect for him to make. So interesting to see how they bounce back in what you would think is kind of a get right game, but against a really good Appalachian State team as well. So I think that the ACC and the Big 12, as you look at it right now, Mark, probably looks like a one-bid league from either one, particularly the ACC, right? I mean, I think, Miami looked really good against Florida. You got to feel for Florida a little bit. I don't know if, coaches, I can picture his name right now. His name is escaping me. For Florida right now. Anyways.
Billy Napier.
Billy Napier, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if he survives the year. I mean, he'll survive the year, but I don't know if he survives to another year. Depending, because their schedule is just brutal the last 5 or 6 games, particularly. And now they may have a little bit of quarterback, not controversy, but competition. Where does it go? after Samford. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the Big 12 is to me is a wide open. I mean, I think you've got Oklahoma State, you've got Utah, you've got Kansas State, as probably the three favorites, right? That are there, but how does that work out? I mean, I could see a situation where that they could potentially get two bids, right? I mean, you could see a situation where if Oklahoma State didn't win the conference, they could get themselves within that top 12. So I mean, I think then you've got the Big Ten. I think that was interesting. You've got two teams in Michigan and Oregon that really struggled, specifically Oregon being able to run the football. Was really surprising against Idaho. We'll see how they bounce back against Boise this weekend. But yeah, I mean, I think there was a few of the games, I think just overall that maybe wasn't quite as competitive as I thought they would be coming in. I thought Clemson, Georgia would be a little bit more competitive. I thought Miami and Florida would be a little bit competitive. And it's kind of funny. I've seen this tweet or post, whatever we're calling it, from Gabe Eichert after the USC LSU game, and he's basically said, like, it's okay if you want to say that USC is a good football team, right? It doesn't mean that you hate Lincoln Riley any less than you did before. But I was impressed with them. Miller Moss he probably doesn't have maybe not quite the it factor that Caleb Williams does, but he's a really, really solid quarterback in Lincoln Riley's system. And the thing that you've always heard, obviously when Riley was here at Oklahoma, if he can figure out the defensive side of things, then he's going to win the national championship at some point, right? So it did. I mean, it's a small sample size. I came in here when we did our preseason predictions. I wasn't incredibly high on LSU, even more so after this game. Where they just don't seem to have a lot of. To me, they don't have a lot of big time weapons from a skill position perspective. Kyron Lacey is a really solid receiver, but outside of that, they don't have a big time back either. So I think it'll be interesting to see, what comes of that, right? Was it more how well USC played on defense and how much better maybe of a team this is overall coming into 2024 and particularly how they ended 2023? Or is it more of an indictment on LSU? And I think just kind of keeping it at the SEC level, like just how incredibly impressive some of these teams are that played lower caliber teams. Like Alabama looked fantastic. I thought, like, going into that game, like, with everything new, and Western Kentucky's a pretty good team historically. TJ Finley comes over from Texas State. Like, I think I actually picked Western Kentucky, to stay within this. I think it was 30 or 31. Mm-hmm. And, they doubled that. Alabama doubled that. And, Ole Miss could have scored 150 points if they wanted to, in that game. And like we talked about Auburn and Tennessee and some of the others. But the SEC looks the part early on. I know there's some discussion on. There's always discussion. I think the SEC is probably the kind of the big bad wolf of college football, and everybody wants to either knock them down a peg or something like that. But SEC is clearly the number one conference in the country, and I think it'll be. I think it's going to be interesting to see some of these teams as we mentioned specifically when you look at Auburn playing California this week, and when you look at Tennessee playing NC State on what that looks like. Was it more of the competition in week one, or are these teams much improved over what they were a year ago?
Yeah, I was going to go to that same debate that always ensues after week one. Okay, that team scored 50 points against that team that was supposed to be pretty good. So does that mean that team that was supposed to be pretty good really isn't? Or do they have one of the best offenses we've ever seen? And all those arguments about what did we just see? Does it mean more about the team that succeeded being great or the team that failed as being bad? But the one thing I will say about USC is yes, this may not be a vintage LSU team. I think we can all agree on that. But I highly doubt if this is not one of the 20 best teams in America. And I know that they've got a good offense. Do they have a Jaden Daniels offense? No. But I know that they still have a good offense. And if USC was able to hold them to 20 points and really hit well, tackle, look physically like they belonged on the field with LSU. Like USC, the last couple of years under Lincoln Riley, while they're trying to sort out this defense and strength and conditioning goes along with that, even games that they've won or been competitive, it was because they scored 45 points and the defense just kind of got dragged around the field and guys didn't even look like they cared or were invested in tackling or were just, even when they tried, they were just physically not as strong as a team like LSU.
Right.
When they were playing the more physically talented teams on the schedule, they looked like they were overmatched, and they didn't look like that. And so, yeah, and then getting to the LSU and the SEC portion of this, see, a lot of people called me, and I saw in the chat where people were dissing the SEC because they lost 2 games. Oh, well, the SEC is not as good as they think they are because Texas A&M lost and LSU lost. Okay, yes, they lost the games. However, let's understand that Notre Dame's probably going to make a college football playoff, and Texas A&M's the what? The 7th, the 8th best team in the SEC.
Yeah.
And they were tied with 3 or 4 minutes left in the game.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not saying that's not a good win for Notre Dame. It is. They went into a hostile environment, good defense they played, all of that. But from a Texas A&M or an SEC standpoint, let's understand you got to look at the seedings of these teams in these leagues when you match that up. LSU, USC, credit USC. That's a big win for the Big Ten, but that's a coin flip. If you're evaluating the teams, if they went out and played again this weekend, I'm pretty sure that it would again come down to a 1-score game, and I don't know who would win because they're pretty much the same team. So yeah, the SEC, yeah, these like 70-0 games. On one hand, they're not impressive, but not everybody else is doing that, where they're marching out against an FCS team and just doing what you're supposed to do. And everybody did that in the SEC. Now, South Carolina didn't do it against Old Dominion, but all the teams that are in the upper to mid tier went out there and pretty much just throttled the opposition.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I love watching his podcast. So this conversation was on there last night with Josh Pate, and he basically took top to bottom the SEC versus the Big Ten. I think he took like the top 8 or 9 of each. And so what he did is he took the top 8 statistically has the highest odds to make it to the college football playoff from each league. And so and he stacked those two teams against each other. And in every single matchup, the SEC team was favored on the neutral field over the Big Ten team. So, yeah, I think you look at it, and to your point exactly, like South Carolina, Texas A&M, but heck, Vanderbilt even won, right?
Yeah.
Like,
against the team that was supposed to be one of the best teams in the ACC.
Yeah, and so yeah, I mean, it's they're at the bottom. Maybe it's not as great. I mean, but we'll see. South Carolina, I mean, they were bringing in a brand new quarterback, so we'll see how they progress. But yeah,
and that's why it's the bottom.
Yeah,
too.
Yeah. But
it's like that for everyone else.
It's interesting. I think to your point about the playoffs, Mark, I think it's interesting seeing, as a consumer of this product, it's interesting to see how we analyze some of these games early on, right? Like, I mean, I think changing our way of thinking to your point that you made about even Iowa and Iowa State, like, Iowa State probably really needs to win this game because obviously they're unranked and things like that. But I think also in the grand scheme of things, some of these teams that lose a game or two they know that they're not out of it. Obviously, Florida State is the exception, right? Based on what we're seeing on the field, but yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see how we view some of these games, and obviously we've talked about some of these games in November will start meaning a lot more than they did in the past. But then I argue still some of these games in September in week 2 mean as much, the more, or not as much, but more than they have in the past, and maybe as much as some of these games in November will mean.
All right, everyone. We appreciate you being here at the Voice of College Football. It's our Oklahoma show that we do each and every week with Jason. Thanks for stopping by. Please subscribe and hit the bell for the notifications. And what that does is it just lets you know when we are going live. We typically do it on Friday, but it's going to let you know for sure when we go live. All right, Jason, enjoy the game. Probably you'll be able to do some channel surfing in the second half, most likely, but enjoy the game.
All right, will do. Thank you, Mark.